Good morning, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Rappahannock in Whitestone, Virginia. My name is Susan Mosley. I'm the minister here at UUFR, and I will be your service leader for this video service today. UUFR is a caring community whose mission is to put UU principles into practice through spiritual exploration, critical thinking, and social service, and also to provide a future home, a spiritual home for future generations. It is my privilege to welcome you to this service today, May 2nd, 2021.
We are gathered in the Spirit, our bodies are apart, filled with joy and touched with wonder, separate hands but mingled hearts, giving thanks and singing praises for the love that calls us on from our many different places. We are gathered into one. We are gathered in our sorrow. We are gathered in our fear, in our pain and in our worry, in our anger and our tears, as we tend to one another with our gifts and with our care. Our community is strengthened through the faith and hope we share. We are gathered in commitment to a planet that is home, works of justice, acts of kindness, bless the world and heal our souls. As our voices join together, may our song of peace resound. May we offer in abundance all the grace that we have found.
We gather this morning not in person, but in spirit, as people with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. So we light our chalice as a beacon of hope, a sign of our quest for truth and meaning, and in celebration of the life we share together. Our opening words this morning are taken from our songbook, Singing the Living Tradition. May we be reminded here of our highest aspiration and inspired to bring our gifts of love and service to the altar of humanity. May we know once again that we are not isolated beings, but connected in mystery and miracle to the universe, to this community, and to each other. The ritual of joys and concerns is a time when we share what is foremost in our minds and hearts, whether a celebration or a burden. In our sanctuary, we have a water chalice that symbolizes the community that holds us. and small pieces of sea glass to place in the water to represent a joy or concern shared. Since we cannot be together right now, I offer this virtual ritual on behalf of the collective concerns or joys. I offer this piece of glass to represent the very real concerns for racial justice, environmental healing, and the need for reconciliation in this country. I offer this piece to represent the hope that comes with a COVID vaccine, the comfort that comes from belonging to this fellowship, and the joy that bubbles up when kindness is shared. Finally, I offer this piece of glass for all those personal joys, concerns, and prayers that you cannot voice out loud, but that are heard and held by the Spirit of life.
Good morning. The talk I'm going to give later is about why do people believe in the irrational. And I want to get at somewhat indirectly with our reading. And the question for our reading is, can human beings understand the universe? So I've got two answers here. The first is from God, who is answering Job. You remember Job, a very devout person in the Old Testament who complied with all of God's laws, but was suffering enormously. His crops were dying. He was suffering in many ways. So he cries out to God, why are you doing this to me? And here's God's answer. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstones? While the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for times of trouble, for days of war and battle? What is the way to the place where lightning is dispersed, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm to water a land where no one lives? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of heaven? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, here we are? In other words, God is saying, you don't have the foggiest idea what's going on. You're not capable of understanding the universe. So that's one response. Here's another. This is a response by Albert Einstein to a letter asking him if he believed in God. Einstein says the following: your question is the most difficult in the world. It's not a question I can answer simply with yes or no. I'm not an atheist. I do not know if I can define myself as a pantheist. The problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. May I not reply with a parable? The human mind, no matter how highly trained, cannot grasp the universe. We're in the position of a little child entering a huge library whose walls are covered to the ceiling with books in many different tongues. The child knows that someone must have written those books. It does not know who or how. It does not understand the languages in which they are written. The child notes a definite plan in the arrangement of the books, a mysterious order which it does not comprehend, but only dimly suspects. That, it seems to me, is the attitude of the human mind even the greatest and most cultured toward God. We see a universe marvelously arranged, obeying certain laws, but we understand the laws only dimly. Our limited minds cannot grasp the mysterious force that sways the constellations.
Hello to all of you. Thank you for joining me in this guided meditation, a time we take during our time together to quiet ourselves, to take a moment to settle into a place of comfort, to settle into the rhythm of our own breath. Perhaps to watch yourselves breathing in, breathing out, to experience the coolness of your breath on the in-breath, or the warmth on your out-breath. Just take a moment to feel the air passing through the pathways. Take a moment imagining you're looking through the world with wide eyes, or to allow your vision to blur. If you like, you may close your eyes just for a moment. And when you do, perhaps you will settle into that place of comfort that we cherish, or settle into a place of quiet questioning, a place where we hold certain questions deep in our interior world, a place where we ponder, where we give credibility to our questions. Consider how allowing our inner questions to surface to our conscious mind, to let this be a time to acknowledge our own truth. As we engage in these moments of exploration, I invite each of you to consider how your questions may be viewed by your neighbor. To consider, so to speak, on which side of the mountain are you standing? To consider which side of the mountain our speaker today, Correia, is standing. I invite you to see which side of the mountain your neighbor is standing. There is so much to consider, so much to agree upon, so much to oppose, so much to take into consideration. I invite you to hear the words and wisdom that Eddie brings to you today, to speak an internal amen when you agree, or an internal wait a minute when you disagree. I invite you to bring forth your questions, to bring them into the light of day, to share them with your fellow neighbors, to be kind and gentle with yourselves, and to be kind and gentle with those who may stand on the opposite side of the mountain, and to be empathetic and vigilant in seeking your own truth. And as you take these moments to ponder, to settle into your place of knowing, I invite you to return to the awareness of your breath, to return your attention to the external world. And in the words of our pastor, Susan Mosley, let it be so.
I've ever done. He said, woman, woman, you've got 5 husbands. He said, woman, woman, you've got 5 husbands. He said, woman, 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 you've got 5 husbands, and the one you have now, he's not your own. He's not your own. She said, this man, he must be a prophet. She said, this man, he must be a prophet. She said, this man, he must be a prophet. He done told me everything I've ever done. Jesus met the woman at the well. Jesus met the woman at the well. Jesus met the woman at the well. And he told her everything she'd ever done.
We know that our financial contributions to this congregation come from sacrifice and hard work. We are grateful for this and commit together to ensure the funds we gather collectively do a greater good for this fellowship and our world than they could have done alone. May there be an offering to sustain and grow the life and mission of this congregation, and may we give in love, in hope, and in generosity. Our speaker today is Eddie Correia. Eddie is a longtime member of UUFR and has spoken on multiple occasions throughout the past years. We always look forward to Eddie's talks. But for those of you who don't know who he is, I want to give you just a little thumbnail sketch. Eddie Correia is a Washington, D.C. attorney and an adjunct professor at American University's Law School. Eddie was chief counsel of the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee and served in the Clinton administration as special counsel to the president for civil rights in the White House. He is also a member of the board of directors of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. On top of all that, Eddie has written several books, a couple of novels, and he is the author of a book called The Uncertain Believer, Reconciling God and Science. And in addition to that one, he wrote a book for parents of children, and the title for that book is Teaching Your Child About God and a Scientific World. Eddie brings a wealth of experience and knowledge, and we always look forward to his talks. So please join me in welcoming Eddie back to the pulpit.
This is the beginning of a 4-part series on why people believe in the irrational. The talks are more or less chronological. The first talk is traditional religion irrational? And that's going to take us through the development of Christianity through Thomas Aquinas. The second talk is the Enlightenment and the limits of rationality. So that's going to take us through the Enlightenment. And part 3 is the irrational in the 20th century, and part 4 is the irrational in the 21st century. Now let's begin this way. What does it mean to say a belief is rational or irrational? Well, if it's rational, you arrive at a belief through reason rather than superstition or bias or guesswork. So let's use that definition as we go through. Now, how did religion begin? Imagine sitting on a Mediterranean beach in 5000 BCE and observing the stars and the Milky Way, and during the day the sun cross over the sky. You had to begin to think that there were very powerful divine forces that were in charge of these natural phenomena. Natural to assume perhaps they were somewhat like people. You know, they were large and they were powerful, but perhaps they were petty and jealous and prone to anger, just like the Greek gods turned out to be. So societies developed these complex pantheons of gods to explain natural phenomena. The Mesopotamians had a complex pantheon, and of course the Greeks did, later adopted by the Romans. And then further east, Hindus had a complex, even more complex pantheon of gods to try to understand, to try to explain the universe. Now, was any of that rational? Well, let's go back to our definition. Did they get through reason? Traditionally, two types of reasoning: deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is basically rules of logic based on assumptions. All men are mortal. Socrates was a man, therefore Socrates was mortal. That's an example of deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is relying on a series of empirical observations. You see the same observation many, many times. You conclude what's going to happen again. And then you can make some conclusions about causation and what that phenomenon is. Turns out both types of reasoning have weaknesses. Deductive reasoning has the problem that it all depends on the assumptions. And if your assumptions are wrong, you can try to be logical, but it's not going to get you in the right direction. For example, it was assumed that the speed of light varies depending on the velocity of the source, just like other objects. But it turned out that the speed of light always is constant, even if the source of the light is moving. How can we explain that? Well, it took Einstein to tell us. We explain it because time moves more slowly under some circumstances. Light speed is constant, but time may slow down. So people were just misinterpreting their observations. Religious reasoning has the same problem. Let's take the observations about the sun going across the sky. Everybody would assume, or everybody did assume pretty much, that meant the earth was stationary and the sun was moving, till Copernicus demonstrated that no, it's really the sun that's not moving, the earth is going around it. But religious leaders just could not accept that and rejected it. And when Galileo published something, they brought him to a trial. Religion has really, first of all, made its own misinterpretations of observations, but it's hard to justify religious beliefs based on deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, just because those types of reasonings always have problems. For example, another problem with inductive reasoning, it's the post hoc propter hoc phenomenon. After this, therefore, because of this. When primitive people saw that if they didn't sacrifice to a particular god, there was a natural disaster, then it must have been because we didn't pay homage to that god. Or we did give sacrifices to the rain god, and then that was followed by a lot of rain, and the crops were very successful. What's the problem with that? They're misinterpreting their observations and drawing the wrong conclusions from them. Now, Let me talk about the early development of Christianity. Jesus was a Jew, of course, and probably had a very simple theology in a way. Probably he was trying to promote a recognition among Jews that they ought to not talk about technical laws and be so concerned about technical dietary laws and so forth, as much as loving their neighbor. A very simple, very powerful message. Also believed that the earth, as we know it, was going to come to an end. The kingdom of God would be established on earth, and it was coming pretty soon. Now, when he lived, there were several other ideological movements around the Mediterranean. Romans still had their pagan beliefs. The Jews were there, but Jews have never been proselytizers. Same thing today. They really don't feel a need to go get recruits, whereas the Jesus movement certainly did. Further east, there was Hinduism and Buddhism. So there were a lot of competitors about ideology and religion at the time Jesus died and in the centuries after he lived. Now, depending on how events had gone, Christianity may have died out. There was no guarantee it was going to be successful. But there were some amazing developments that were working for Christianity. First, the Christians had great promoters, particularly Paul, who developed a full-blown theology. As I say, the Jesus theology was pretty simple. The Paul's theology is much more complex, and it grows more complex over the centuries after that. Talking about the afterlife and how to achieve salvation. And good news for the men, you don't have to be circumcised. So it was promoting recruits to Christianity that way. Paul might have written as many as 14 of the 27 chapters of the New Testament. Probably not that many, 7 for sure, and probably more. Nevertheless, if you're going to promote a movement, you want somebody like Paul to do that for you. A second factor probably was the spiritual commitment of the early Christians. They were in many cases willing to die rather than to submit to Roman authority about religion, willing to become martyrs. And no doubt that left a very powerful impression on Roman society and Roman emperors. Another factor, the conversion of Constantine in the 4th century. The emperor of Rome, his mother was a Christian. The story is he went out before a battle and saw the symbols of Christ in the cloud. Probably the story is even more complex than that, but the bottom line was he converted to Christianity. So even more important than having a good marketing director like Paul is having the Roman emperor endorse your religion. That's pretty effective. And then that was followed decades later by Theodosius, a subsequent emperor, declaring Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So the Christianity went from a persecuted sect within, at the margins of society, within a few decades to being or a few centuries to say, let's carry it through to Theodosius, to being the dominant religion in the Western world. Pretty amazing success story. Now, once Christianity was the established religion, then that set the stage for the development of the Catholic organization and the hierarchy, and the ability of the Catholic Church to set doctrine and require compliance with it, adherence to it. Now, at the core of Christianity has always been the Jesus story, which is a very powerful story. Obviously compelling, obviously persuaded millions of people over the centuries to become Christians. But the Catholic Church brought a very complex theology with it. By the time of Aquinas in the 13th century, there were doctrines about marriage and sexuality and celibacy for priests and the afterlife, what happens to infants who die before baptism. Very complex theology, very little of it based on what Jesus actually taught. There was intense struggle over very fine points of doctrine. The Arian heresy had to do with the Bishop Arian saying that Well, because the Bible talks about Jesus being begotten from God, therefore he must have been somehow secondary to God. He came later. That was rejected in the Council of Nicaea by the predominant leaders of the church. But, that's a pretty fine point of doctrine. You could imagine having a divinity school seminar on that. But to go out and kill each other for it, burn each other at the stake over those fine points of doctrine, not very useful, not very meaningful in any genuine way. Now, the church certainly did have a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. No doubt it brought a lot of comfort and inspiration to people based on the Jesus story and basic theology. On the other hand, it was enormously corrupt. It tended to impose doctrinal beliefs on people, whether they were persuaded of them or not. It tended to intimidate people into accepting those beliefs, even if they had questions about them. Remember God's message to Job. You're not smart enough to understand this, so don't even inquire about it. And to take it a step further, which the Catholic Church has, it's sinful to start asking questions. And you could see how the Catholic Church could become a dominant position in coming up with doctrine. It's interesting to speculate that the fragility of Christianity at the turn of the millennium and what would have happened if it hadn't had those enormous advantages. What if it hadn't had a Paul who was willing to be an effective advocate around the Mediterranean for Christianity? What if Constantine had not converted? And so you didn't have this tradition of Roman emperor support. Well, what if the Buddha, to go back earlier to the 6th century BC, what if the Buddha had come west instead of east? And instead of going to China from India, he came east to the west, to the Greek islands around the Mediterranean. He might have started the spark of Buddhism at that point. Or to move forward into history, there's a famous comment by Edward Gibbon, the author of Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. He was talking about the growth of the Islamic Empire in Central and Northwest Europe. In the 8th century, famous battle in France, Battle of Poitiers in 732, which the Muslims lost. And it was kind of the high watermark for their extension into Central Europe. And Gibbon said, if the Muslims had won that battle, perhaps the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught at the schools of Oxford. Remember, the idea was we could have had an Islamic Europe, and that could have been the tradition that was brought to North America too. The point is that dominance of Christianity was not inevitable. Let me talk about Thomas Aquinas, very famous, perhaps one of the most famous theologians in Catholic history. Most popes probably didn't worry about rationality and proving God existed through reason. Aquinas felt the need to do that. He was a big fan of Aristotle and studied Aristotle and felt we can establish God's existence through reason. I really want to do that. He made 5 arguments. They really boil down to 2. The first 4 are very similar. They're variations of each other. That is the first cause argument. Everything, Aquinas would say, has a cause. You go back into time to the earlier cause, and eventually you get the first cause, which must be God. Aristotle talked about the unmoved mover, a sort of similar idea. Now, does that make any sense? Is that rational? Well, maybe if you go off on certain assumptions. Here's the basic assumption. Let's say there is always a first cause, if you go back far enough. Why assume that first cause is like the God of the Bible? Maybe that first cause is some kind of singularity in the universe, some sort of dominance of quantum mechanics or quantum physics to have a sea change in the universe that leads to a Big Bang. The point is that maybe there's a first cause, but it's not necessarily the God of the Bible. The teleological argument is a little bit different. It is we see perfect things in life, or we see things that are almost perfect. We see good things in life. They must have come from something. They must have come from something perfect. All things have a purpose. And so what is the origin of that purpose? Humans have a purpose. Even non-living things have a purpose. That purpose must be God. So we're going back to, again, an assumption that all things have a purpose. And then the further assumption, if they have a purpose, that purpose must be God. Not too persuasive, really. What about inductive reasoning? Could you get to the existence of God through inductive reasoning? Maybe we can't get there through deductive reasoning. The proponents would point to the birth and the birth and death and resurrection of Jesus. But is that really true? We have sketchy accounts, inconsistent accounts even. Probably not a very solid basis for arguing that based on reason alone, the resurrection story. Or how about modern miracles? A child saved in a plane crash and everybody else died. The problem with that is that, well, maybe there are other reasons that child was saved. It was a coincidence. And by the way, what happened to all those other people who died in the plane too? And why would a God allow the Holocaust? Why would a loving God allow a pandemic that kills over 500,000 people? So neither deductive reasoning nor inductive reasoning are very persuasive in getting at a belief about traditional religion if we say we're going to try to get there based on reason. Well, where does all this leave us? If you examine a particular religion, Christianity, I think you'd have to say, in being objective and fair, that based on what we know, it's irrational to adopt Christian beliefs in the sense it's not based on reason. But you could probably say the same thing about Islam and Judaism, Hinduism, other religions. And these are not just some narrow, quaint ideas like don't cross the path of a black cat, on Friday the 13th. Maybe you'd say that's a charming, quaint theory. We're talking about the basic nature of the universe, the fundamental structure of the world we live in, not just some quaint idea. Well, if we conclude that Christianity is irrational based on our traditional definition now, then what? Well, it's not irrational to want to find meaning in our life. It's not irrational to want to have some spiritual core in our existence. The question is how to reconcile rationality with these goals of a spiritual core. Where do we go with that? Well, one option is just to forget the whole thing about rationality, just say rationality is overrated and just have faith. And that is one path. In fact, that's probably the path that most people take. Another path is to say, no, I do want a religion based on reason. I want to find a path to meaning that is consistent with my rational and scientific beliefs. Well, that suggests that we need to step back and build our own personal religion, borrowing what we can from established traditions. In other words, we try to take the best of reasoning and thinking of those who have gone before us and try to get to our own personal beliefs through our own reason. So that's the issue we're going to explore as we go through this series. Thank you.
storm can shake my inmost calm, while to that rock I'm clinging, since love prevails in heaven and earth. How can I keep from singing?
as I prepare to extinguish the chalice, remember that the light lives on in the minds and hearts and souls of each one of us. Carry that flame with you and share it with those you know, those you love, and especially those you have yet to meet. May the blessing of truth be upon us, the power of love direct and sustain us, and may the peace of this community preserve our going out and our coming in until we are together again. Namaste.